to talk about the Bears tonight and a little bit about another team called the Chicago Cardinals. Anybody remember the Cardinals? Oh, Cardinals, great. You guys won prizes up here too because Southside team. I really rolled the dice with that question. Which one basketball game you can take home and treasure forever? Whoops. There you go. So, talking about the Bears and the Cardinals. In fact, all this leads up to something I wanted to share with you in a moment. Let's see if this works. I wanted to thank Megan here for having me, and of course, the branch of the library. Anyone know who number 42 is in the picture?
Good luck, man.
Sid Luckman, you're right. Holy cow, these prizes.
Wow.
I'm going to give you a hand for that.
Really good work.
Oh my gosh. So we're talking about the Bears, 9 NFL titles, 783 wins. There's another team that's creeping up on that number this year.
Green Bay.
Green Bay is one behind. Gee, you win another one. And you thought I was a dinosaur. So here's some dinosaurs to make up remember this night. 14 retired numbers and 30 members in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. But I want to thank 2 people tonight for their input on this presentation. Guy on the left is someone you may have heard about named Dutch Sterneman. He was a co-owner of the Chicago Bears back in the 20s with a guy named George Hallis. And the neat thing about Sterneman is that he kept all the finances for the Bears. And his family finally, after almost 90 years, has donated all his papers to the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Now, I have no life, but that kind of stuff makes me excited. And so I was able to go to the Pro Football Hall of Fame with my wife about 145 times to look through a couple hundred boxes of papers and documents. But that is really neat because now we know how many people went to games, how much money the Bears had. And I'm really going to be happy to share some of that with you tonight. Whoops, I forgot the other guy. A good-looking guy, looks a lot like me. That's my dad, also named Joe Ziemba. And he played football in Chicago at Mount Carmel High School. Then he went to a little place called Benedictine, not in Illinois, but in Kansas. It was called St. Benedict's then. And he played football. He was named first team All-American. It was a small college All-American. Then they didn't have different divisions, but they played Creighton and New Mexico State and Wichita State. And he got drafted by that team we just talked about, the Chicago Cardinals. Here's a trick question. Anybody want to guess how much money he made as a rookie in the National Football League?
$1,000.
A little less, but that's close. In fact, you're going to win a valuable prize. You may need a disguise to get out of here tonight, so here it is. Congratulations. For his rookie season back in the 40s, his contract was $110 a game, plus the players had to provide their own shoulder pads and cleats. So he hurt his knee in training camp, which was held at Morgan Park Military Academy in Chicago, decided he was not going to have surgery. He could make more money coaching high school football. So that's what he did. And so I was grateful because of him, led to my starting to write books, research football history. The first one on the left was all about the Chicago Cardinals, called When Football Was Football. A few years ago, we were lucky enough to get mentioned in Sports Illustrated, so now it's out of print. And then about 3 years ago, Cadets, Cannons, and Legends, which is about my dad, basically. He coached at Morgan Park Military Academy, the same place that had the Cardinals training camp back in the 40s. And their history goes way back. In fact, he is still the all-time leading coach in terms of wins at the school, which is pretty good. But I didn't tell you the school hasn't played football in 44 years, but still, he would have been near the top. That's a fun story. And then finally, the Bears versus Cardinals, the NFL's oldest rivalry, which will be out this month. But copies are available tonight. I'm not going to give any kind of commercial, but these are pre-publication, I guess you call them. They're not really available in any bookstore yet. So we are offering them tonight only, about 40% off. So if you'd like one afterwards, we'd be glad to face it and write something in it for you. But don't feel under any obligation. we're happy that they came early instead of the end of the month. So a lot of the material, if not all of it, that you'll see tonight is coming out of this book. So we're really, really happy to share it. And of course, you got to put up with a knucklehead. Anybody know who this guy is? And don't say me. Who said Alfred E. Newman? All right, sir, you won it. And I know you're a big fan of the Bears, so you get your own Bears pennant.
I have one grandson who likes the Bears. He gets it.
Congratulations, Alfred E. Newman. My dad did say it looked like him when I was younger, so I don't see the resemblance. He's much better looking. Well, so some of the stuff we'll talk about is the changes in football. No equipment, no headgear way back when. And of course, we're not going to cover how helmets were tested in 1912. That's a real picture of football helmet testing. We're very concerned with safety nowadays, but that was it. Have a guy run into a brick wall, literally. And of course, the rules on the field were different in colleges and the pros. I love this picture. If you can't tackle a guy, just punch him out and hope the ref doesn't see it. There's a lot of stories in the book about some of the roughness. A lot of them are the Chicago players, the Cardinals and the Bears as well. Anybody ever hear of Ed Sprinkle?
Yeah.
Meanest man in football.
Oh, yeah.
He got in some battles. He was with the Bears, just made the Hall of Fame. And I have some really neat stories in the book about him and Charlie tripping to the Cardinals getting into battles. And the fans have changed. I'm going to close the door.
Thank you.
Sorry. Anyone notice anything different about this photo?
All ladies and all Christmas. Barricades, not the ladies.
A lot of ladies, yes. In fact, this is from the University of Chicago in 1899. And the powers that be there decided that men and ladies should be separated during a football game. The ladies might hear bad words. I think that's true because my wife, who was here today when the Bears or Notre Dame was on, I'm forced upstairs into the attic. I have a little 12-inch black and white, and I can look real close and watch it and say anything I want because it won't bother her. And sometimes we get passionate. But that was a good answer about the ladies being on there. In fact, I think you might think that we're a super presentation if you get your own puzzle.
Thank you.
Congratulations. But our story tonight is going to begin with two men. One on the left, George Halas. Everyone's heard of him. He's a legend. On the right is Chris O'Brien. Probably may have never heard of him. He was the guy that basically started the Cardinals, which are now the Arizona Cardinals, way back with his brother and another friend in 1899. And it's become the oldest rivalry in the NFL, which we're going to talk about. And ironically, that book, which I'm not going to mention again, covers the entire thing from 1920 all the way through 1960 when the Cardinals left Chicago. The Cardinals did begin back in 1899, and a year later they became the Morgan Athletic Club on the South Side. But their first game took place back in 1899 when they beat a team called the Shermans. And a lot of the teams back then took the names of streets. For example, we had the Westerns, the Peorias, the Greens, the Damons. And if you're familiar with the South Side of Chicago, your street may have had a football team back in the 1890s. They began with a new name in 1901. And most of the history books will tell us that the Cardinals' name came from the color of a jersey that Chris O'Brien got from the University of Chicago. But actually, they started a new social club called the Cardinals Social and Athletic Club. And that's where the name Cardinals came from in 1901. And then in 1902, they crowned themselves the champions of Illinois. I don't know why. There was no tournament. They played about 5 games for guys on the South Side, but they thought that was good enough to be the champions. So if anyone keeps records, I guess it's true. Wait, some people say they were named after the used jerseys, that Chris O'Brien was the owner of the team. Not quite accurate. In fact, I went back and did some research at the University of Chicago. I could not find any record of Amos Alonzo Staggs selling jerseys to the Cardinals back then. And I did find old photos to compare, and they have different C's. And of course, we don't have colored jerseys to tell if they are maroon in color. So I'm going to go with what I know, and the research shows that the Cardinals name actually came from a name that they named their club after in 1901. But a lot of these stories started showing up in the late 40s and 50s by the publicity director of the Cardinals named Eddie McGuire. And Eddie was fond of tall tales. In fact, one of the ends on the team at the bottom there, he said that Eddie McGuire would say he was the lightest end in pro football at 210 pounds. And after the guy left the Cardinals, he said, well, I weighed 240, but it was a real good story. So Eddie McGuire was the author of a lot of these articles about some of the hearsay and the legends of the Cardinals. And Chris O'Brien, there's a new photo I found. He's wearing number 8. He's managing the Morgan baseball team. And he was part of teams with the Cardinals, the Morgans, and the Normals on the south side. And this is really a wacky name for everyone. In 1917, in the state of Illinois, the Racine Cardinal Pleasure Club was incorporated. It doesn't sound much like a football team, but it was incorporated in 1917 for sociability and pleasure. And its worldwide headquarters were in the basement of Chris O'Brien's house. So that was football back in 1917. So we kind of brought you up to date on the early days of the Cardinals. We should probably get into the Bears with George Halas. Of course, whenever time you mention Halas's name, you think of football with the Bears starting the league. But he was too little to play football in high school. In fact, he went to Crane Tech on the west side of Chicago. And these are the first photos, and these appear in the book of George Halas as an athlete. Anyone want to guess where he is in the team photo on the left? Hard to see. Bottom row?
Second row.
You got it, which means you are eligible for a fabulous prize. In fact, your guess was in the cards, so congratulations. Look at you wondering.
Thank you so
I'm so glad you came. George Halas was a little measly 110-pounder at Crane Tech High School, bottom row, second from the left. And on the right is what I believe is the only earliest surviving action photo of George Halas. It's a pose photo. He's on the left of the right photo, taking out a guy. They're playing a game called indoor baseball, which was similar to what we now call 16-inch softball in Chicago. Anybody ever play that? You probably got bent fingers. Yeah, it's okay. I have one or two. It's mostly from holding in front of my face, which wasn't too smart. But back then, before basketball was really popular in Chicago, they needed an indoor sport for the kids in the high schools. And they could get a room like this. They played with a soft, mushy ball that was about 12 inches compared to the 16-inch today. And their bat was a broomstick about 3 feet long at that. And the bases were only 20 feet apart, so the door might have been one base. But they would mark off the walls if you were lucky to hit it. If you hit it above a certain line, you'd have a double, a triple, or a home run, or maybe you could beat out a little hit to the pitcher. But the difference between softball today and the indoor baseball then was the pitcher could throw fast and hard. And so there's a lot of strikeouts because he might have been only, I think the pitching guy was only 20 feet away as well, if not a little closer. But Halas and his brother were both great. Halas finally played football his senior year at Crane Tech on the lightweight team, because he was still only about 130 pounds and he played on the line. But as he grew, he got a little better. When he went to Illinois in 1914, he sat out his freshman year because they were not eligible. His sophomore year, he decided to break his leg. His junior year, he broke his jaw. And so he was part of the Order of the Broken Jaw at Illinois with another teammate, which is kind of unusual. Remember, they didn't have face masks or things, and so injuries were a little bit different, facial injuries. Most of the old-time players will say that they would use their shoulders or their legs to block and tackle, which is seems a little different than today. They didn't use their head as a spear, as we sometimes see. But he did play baseball and basketball at Illinois, so he was a three-sport star. He enlisted in the U.S. Navy in January of 1918 and was stationed up at Great Lakes, which was the biggest break he could have had because he was still a growing boy. And he became part of their football, basketball, and baseball teams. So here's another trick question. Which two Chicago legends played together in the 1919 Rose Bowl? One, in fact, was the most valuable player. Anyone want to guess? I think we just talked about one of them. Oh, you said Hallis and Driscoll back there. Congratulations. I knew you'd get it. You probably thought I lost my marbles. You did your own marbles. Take home. Wonderful football. Congratulations. So that's Patty Driscoll on the right, also in the Navy. George Hallis was also in the Navy. Back in 1918, there was a really difficult flu, similar to what we've experienced the last couple of years. Colleges didn't have teams, or else they played one or two games. Large crowds were prohibited. So the service teams, in this case, Great Lakes, had a wonderful football team because they were signing up and really advertising for pro baseball and pro football players. I shouldn't say pro football, we didn't have that then, but college players to come and play for Great Lakes, which they did. So Great Lakes had a great team. They played Notre Dame, they played Illinois, I believe they played Michigan, and they were invited to play in the Rose Bowl against Mare Island. It was the only time the Rose Bowl, which is still called the granddaddy of all the Rose Bowl games, excuse me, all the bowl games. And the Great Lakes was there at that time. So they won the game. Hallis had a wonderful performance, was named the most valuable player. But he came home after that and he told his mother that he wasn't going to play football any longer. He got a job with the railroad, used his engineering degree, made $45 a week. So he thought this was great until the spring that fall of 1919, it would have been by then. There was a semi-professional team in Hammond, and they invited Hallis to come play football with them for $100 a game, which was double his working salary. So he went back on his promise to his mother and played pro football, basically. This is the NFL was started. And he went to Hammond, took a couple of trains over there and made the games. They used to practice once a week and then play a game on Sunday. But he ran into a guy on the left named Jim Thorpe, probably the best known athlete of the century. And back then in football, if you were a ball carrier and you carried the ball and you were knocked down, you could still get up and keep running until the ball carrier surrendered and said, I'm down. Well, Hallis made the mistake against Jim Thorpe. He took a punt back and Thorpe knocked him down. And as he moved away, Hallis started crawling away on all fours with the football. And Jim Thorpe, seeing this, got really upset. I could use stronger words. Went after Hallis and landed on him with both knees. Hallis said, I'm down. But Thorpe, when he had him down on the ground, he said, if you're going to act like a horse, I'm going to treat you like one. So Hallis said he learned his lesson with Jim Thorpe. So from the Hammond Pros, there was something else for Hallis to do the next year. Question, anyone know if George Hallis and the Bears began playing in Chicago in 1920?
No.
Nope.
Decatur Staley.
Decatur Staleys. Both you gentlemen are going to get a wonderful prize for that. They became the Decatur Staleys, was where Hallis went. Sir, I know you went at Cardinals. You did your own Cardinals. Harmonically, you can entertain this with all the sleeper in this presentation. So Hallis got a call in early 1920 from the A.E. Staley Company down in Decatur. The owner of the company said, would you like to come down and play on our football team, manage the team, coach it, recruit some players? We'd like to kind of go big time and publicize the company that way. So the Decatur Staleys and Hallis began in 1920. The team started in 1919. But they played teams from like Kewanee, Illinois, and Peoria. They weren't ready for the big time. When Hallis came, he went on probably the first recruiting trip, picked up players that had been at Michigan and Notre Dame, and they wanted to play a big time schedule. But one of the things that Hallis got promised to him before he took the job was he asked, could my players play and also practice daily along with working? So everybody that Hallis recruited got a job at the Staley Company in the plant, but he also got them off of work 2 hours early every day to practice, which was a huge advantage for everyone. If you remember the Cardinals in Chicago, they practiced about once a week under streetlights, kind of like when we were kids. When the lights came on, we'd throw the ball. There was the streets and the alleys. The driveway was out of bounds or the goal line. So Hallis had a huge advantage with his Staley team. And then in September of 1920, both George Halas and Chris O'Brien went to Canton, Ohio for the formation of the American Professional Football Conference. Not the NFL yet, that took a year or so. And because the Professional Football League wanted to get some publicity, they named Jim Thorpe, who we talked about a moment ago, as their first president.
Yeah.
Thorpe was a great player, not so great as a business person. He only lasted a year. I want to tell one Jim Thorpe story if I could. As you may have known, after his athletic ability started going downhill a little bit, he liked to drink. And he was very good at it. And one time, his team, by that time, was called the Oorang Indians. Not politically correct now, but it was a team from Ohio, rural Ohio, that was formed with Native Americans, the entire roster, to publicize the dog kennel and brought the team together. Well, anyway, they came to play the Bears. Night before the game, they were in a bar on Michigan Avenue, and the bartender said it's closing time. Murphy's got to leave. And one of the Indian players, the Oorang Indians, got an idea. He told the bartender there was a phone call in the phone booth. Remember phone booths? We don't see those anymore. So the bartender went in the phone booth. The players on the team wrapped rope around it so he couldn't get it out. They turned it upside down and then proceeded to stay in the bar for as long as they liked. Needless to say, the Bears slammed them the next day. I think they won by about 30 points. But that was a Jim Thorpe story, and that was a little bit of his leadership back then. So most of the early teams in what would become the National Football, they were from small towns. Here's an ad from Rock Island, which was promoting the Racine Cardinals. As you remember, the name Racine came from Racine Pleasure Club, but it was the street where Chris O'Brien, who was managing the team, lived. So they were called the Racine Cardinals. In fact, the minutes from the very first NFL meeting say that the Racine, Wisconsin Cardinals were one of the founding members of the league. So that was never corrected. But during 1920, they changed the name to the Chicago Cardinals. And here's Staley Field, where the Staleys played in 1921. It held about 1,500 fans, which was starting to pose a problem for the owner of the company. He was paying for these players to be on his payroll, the uniforms, the travel, but he also gave all the employees half-price tickets if they liked to come to the game. And with that few capacity that they had, they weren't bringing much money in. It reminded me of my own career, which was bad as well as the speaking thing tonight, but I was in business and I was always enthralled with marketing. And one of the first studies I saw that really interested me was one made for a cafeteria. Remember those where you take your piece of pie for a quarter, or your sandwich or your apple, and wherever you put on your tray, that's what you paid for. Unless you remember the movie Animal House, with Belushi, John Belushi, put everything on his tray because it was free. But anyway, this cafeteria opened, they had big crowds, but they weren't making money. So the owners called in an expert. The expert spent 3 weeks inside checking the food out. Did it taste good? How much money were they making on each sandwich or each piece of chicken? What was the customer base? Was it couples? Was it individuals? Was it families? How long did they stay? Did they go back for seconds? How much would this cost with the employees? So after putting everything together after 3 weeks, came back with the report. The owners expected a huge manual. Instead, it contained 3 words. 3 words were use bigger trays. And that was kind of the same problem that the National Football League had. Small cities, small capacities. They started weeding out some of the smaller towns of Muncie, Indiana, and Akron, and Rock Island, and Hammond, Indiana. So you get the bigger teams like New York Giants in the league. But around this time was when Staley told Halas that he could go to Chicago and take the team as long as he would use the name Staley's for another year. And he gave Halas about $5,000 of seed money. Of course, Halas in his autobiography says he and Sturdivant agreed to take $100 each for a game for playing and running the team if there was any money. And you may have seen Forbes magazine recent evaluation of the National Football League teams. The Bears are worth $5.8 billion. So I'm not sure they need our tax dollars for that new stadium in a minute, but the money that's involved nowadays. So as I mentioned at the start, Dutch Sternman kept all the financial records back from these times. So we learned how much money the Bears actually were making. And of course, it wasn't too much. They were playing down in Decatur. So they moved to Chicago in end of 1921. In my book, which I'm not going to mention again, I really didn't know if I trusted some of the stories in there. For example, George Hellis wrote his autobiography 50 years after a lot of this happened. And now we have the ability to go back and find newspapers, whether in libraries or on the internet. And some of the stories didn't add up. So I have a new theory about why Hellis left Decatur. Now, normally some sheer marketing guy would say, yeah, buy the book and find out what happened. But I wouldn't do that. I think Hellis was kicked out of Decatur. I think he was draining the company of money. And from some of the stuff we found, the company was in great financial shape. But that was one of the neat stories that'll be in the book. And what about the Cardinals? We talked that they were called Racine Cardinals, but in October of 1920, they became Chicago. Chris O'Brien figured out that, yeah, let's might as well take in a much bigger area than our own street for our audience. And then the oldest rivalry began in 1920. It was the first time the teams that are known today as the Bears and the Cardinals met. That was the Chicago Cardinals and the Decatur Staleys in November of 1920. Followed a year later when the Cardinals met Green Bay, a newcomer to the league, you may have heard of. And then also a week later is when the Staleys and the Green Bay Packers finally met. And a lot of times, of course, the Packers and the Bears still play, but it does drive me nuts when you'll see on the television, Bears and Packers, the NFL's oldest rivalry. So I decided to write a book about that to prove them wrong. I have no life. But A.E. Staley told Hellis professional teams need a big city, and he was right. Chicago was a good sports city. In 1921, the Staleys won their first NFL title. Yeah, it was a little controversial. They were in second place, and Hellis invited the team from Buffalo to come to Chicago to play. Said it would be an exhibition. The Staleys won, ended up with the best record. Buffalo thought it was an exhibition game. Bears said it wasn't, it was a real game. The owners finally decided that the Bears were the champions. And there's the first bit of advertising I've ever been able to find, which was with the Staleys and the Green Bay Packers that appeared in the Chicago Tribune back in 1921. Of course, the Packers were no saints either. Curly Lambeau, who was a player coach at the time, used some ineligible players. The Packers were kicked out of the league in 1921. Over the winter, they reorganized under Lambeau and came back in the league again. Here's something. Anybody remember what colors that the Bears wear? I think she said blue and gold, wasn't it? Blue and orange? I think it was. That's right. Oh, man. You too get your own dinosaurs to remind you of all the old stuff you want to do. Congratulations. But the first 3 years the Bears played, they actually wore red uniforms, which I didn't know. There's a gentleman down in Decatur who had some research, shared the photo. But where did the name of the Bears come from? Did Herman Munster think of it? Herman would have been a great tight end. Hogs didn't seem to work in Chicago, although a lot of the Chicago Cardinals worked at the stockyards. Or maybe someone really liked the Chicago Cubs. And that's what happened. George Hellis named his team the Bears out of respect for Mr. William Wrigley, who gave him a wonderful deal on renting the stadium. So if baseball players are Cubs and football players must be Bears. So that's where the name came from. And I got to share with you about the first great fight. This is a photo from the Chicago Tribune about that day in 1922. And what happened was, and I'll set this up for you, Eddie Driscoll, we talked about, carried the ball for the Cardinals against the Bears in the game at Comiskey Park. As he went around the end, if you were George Hellis, you were George Sternman, you would not only tackle me, but throw me to the ground, face down. Driscoll was stunned. It wasn't just tackled, he was brutalized by those guys. He got up and started swinging. And he knocked Joey Sternman out. That was a brother of Dutch. He was only about 5'7", but so was Patty Driscoll. So the two guys got in a fight. And then players from both teams joined in. It became a brawl. Then fans poured out from the stands. They started fighting. The Bears were in a bad spot because they were the visitors. It got so bad, the police were called. They came on horseback, and they finally broke the fight up. But it got so intense that an article in the Chicago Tribune said that George Hallis was knocked down and strangled by a gentleman who had a pistol to his head. And Hallis never denied it, but it was such a bad fight. But Ed Healy, who was here on the right, was just purchased by the Bears, the first free agent in football. And he said, recalling the game, out from the Cardinal bench poured a group of men with guns on to protect their idol, Patty Driscoll. You had that Al Capone crowd. So here came that bunch of South Side rooters. Well, in the end, Driscoll and Hallis both got kicked out of the game. The Cardinals went on to win 6-0. And in his autobiography, Hallis wrote, yeah, sure, we lost the game 6-0. It was a hard-fought battle, but everyone had a good time. Football, 1922. 3 years later, Red Grange came in to save the league. And by saving it, at the time, there still wasn't a great amount of attendance. And that was really the only way that a team could have revenue was the attendance at the games. They were starting to move into baseball parks, bigger stadiums like the colleges were using. But Red Grange, the All-American at Illinois, was signed by the Bears the day after his last game in college at the University of Illinois. Some people said this is really against the rules because the pros are not supposed to sign anyone who's still in college. Hallis, though, said, well, he finished his eligibility, so I'll sign him. As the league got stronger, they certainly would not have allowed that. But at the time, it was great. The biggest name in sports. Think of Michael Jordan at his prime with the Bulls. Everyone wanted a piece of him. Everyone wanted to see him play. So the Bears signed Hallis. And he joined a group of illustrious players from Illinois. Hallis and Grange were in there. Grange is third from the left. Hallis was fourth from the left. And on the right side are the two Sterneman brothers. So what did Grange get paid? We always hear that he made so much money, which he did for the time in 1925. And this is difficult to read. But thanks to the Sterneman papers, we see that $54,000 was taken in by 31,000 in attendance. Grange had a manager, the first agent for a pro player, called C.C. Pyle. That was his initials. A lot of people said cash and carry. He made so much money. He promoted everything from a cross-country running race to tennis tournaments and tried to get Grange to sponsor everything from cigarettes to sweaters to hats. And at the time, the Bears and the Cardinals both took $7,000 from the game. And then 35% went to, the remainder went to Pyle. And then he would pay Grange. So they got $9,000. So not a great deal of money, but if you're in college a week earlier, probably buying your hamburger for 5 cents. And now all of a sudden you and your manager are going to split $9,000. So it was pretty good. And as a kind of a comparison, again, you can't read this, but here's a home game again from the Sterneman files from a month earlier when the Bears played Hammond at DePaul University's field, which is no longer there, I believe. 1,800 people showed up, and the Bears that day made $972 because they had to pay 45% to Hammond as a visiting team. So you can see what Grange really did. The Bears then went on a tour. They played in front of 70,000 people in New York with the Giants, and then had a game in Washington where they were able to meet the president, Calvin Coolidge. This was a special day for Grange. He mentioned it in his autobiography. As Hallis and Grange went to the White House, they were waiting, and the secretary told them to come into the Oval Office, which they did. And the secretary introduced them to President Calvin Coolidge. He said, Mr. President, I'd like to introduce you to Red Grange and George Hallis, and they're with the Chicago Bears. The president smiled, walked over and shook their hands and said, welcome to the White House, gentlemen. I've always enjoyed animal acts. So we can assume that our president didn't know much about sports back then. In the 1930s, the Bears returned to prominence. They won titles in 32 and 33, including the first indoor championship game, which was played at the Chicago Stadium in 1932. And after that game, divisions were made, and so there was actually a championship. Before that, the winner of the league supposedly was supposed to have the best record, but there was controversies in a couple of seasons, and the owners would decide who was the champion. So now there would be a clear champion. And then we saw the emergence of Bronco Nagurski, the best football name ever. Coach of the Giants said, he's the only back I ever saw who runs his own interference. He was 6'2", about 250. A new book about Nagurski just came out from Chris Willis of NFL Films that I would highly recommend. He has some of the correspondence between Bronco and George Halas and how tight Halas was with money. And I say tight because in 1930, when Nagurski was a rookie, he was the highest paid player with $5,000. Let's take a closer look. You can see him up at the top, $5,000 for Nagurski for a 14-game season. And that was the most he ever made in the National Football League. A couple names below him, Joe Ziemba from the University of Notre Dame. He was the second highest player with $4,000 that was guaranteed. It was a similar case to Red Grange. Ziemba got kicked out of Notre Dame for a very strange reason. Anyone want to guess what might have been such a horrible thing at the time?
He got married.
Got married, correct. You got married at Notre Dame, you were kicked out. Whoa, I got to find a special present for that. You know, your time is running short in here. I know everyone's looking at their watches. When's this guy going to get done? So here's your old timer. No one's ever gotten this before. That's great. So Ziemba, though, he was a football player, only played 3 games for the Bears. And then he became a pro wrestler. He actually wrestled Nagurski. But what people don't know about him, during World War II, he could speak several dialects, languages, including the different accents and dialects in Italy. He went undercover during the war. And he was able to help the Allies win the war because of the intelligence he would bring back. So quite a hero on and off the football field. Here's another one from the Sterman collection. He had an actual binder where before computers, figuring everything out, he would write everything in. And what I found most interesting is towards the bottom, Ralph Jones was a coach in the early 30s. He has a note. Bronco Nagurski has a note. Interest paid to Bentley Murray Company, which is a printer. And the Bears couldn't afford to pay the players. Of course, the Depression was starting, so they would give them notes with interest on their salaries. That caused some problems. One is with Jones, the coach in the early 30s, who wasn't getting paid, and I was able to, thanks again to the Sterman papers, find the correspondence between him and Dutch Sterman and George Halas. They didn't pay their coach even though he won an NFL title. This is really fun. This is the Bears banking account in 1931 before the start of the season. Someone made a big deposit of $24, which gave them $256 in the bank to start the season. So no wonder they had to wait for that revenue from the stadium and the attendance. There was no television, no radio back then. Well, radio was starting, but nothing like it is today with the television contracts. And of course, the Bears played up at Wrigley Field. A really nice deal that they got. They paid 20% of their gross back to Wrigley. But there was a stipulation in there that if the attendance was less than 10,000, the percentage would fall down to about 15 or even 10%. So Halas really didn't lose. A lot of places said your fee is $50,000 to play a game, and you got to pay that. Well, he only had to pay based on what the attendance was. So it was a nice deal. And as you know, Wrigley Field, it's kind of tight to put a football field in there. If you've ever been up there. In fact, the end zone runs into the brick wall, which would be left field now, I believe. And this is Dick Plasman, one of the last players not to wear a helmet in the National Football League. He hit that wall pretty hard one day and missed about 3 weeks with his concussion. Which leads me to another Bronco Nagurski story. Some of you may have heard about Bronco, who would carry the ball from the fullback position down low, lead with his head, and just kind of shrug tacklers off because at 250 pounds, he was bigger than most linemen. Well, he was heading from the end zone from about the 5-yard line. Nagurski had the ball, knocked one guy away, knocked another, kept his head down. Of course, the wall was right there. Hit the wall with a full head of steam. It bounced him back. He was a little groggy. He walked back to the bench, and Halas came running over him and said, Bronco, are you okay? He said, yeah, coach. Okay, I scored, didn't I? He said, yeah, you scored a touchdown. And Bronco said, yeah, those guys, they're not so tough. The first guy was nothing, the second guy bounced off, but that third guy really packed a wow. The dangers of Wrigley Field. And here's those end zones when the Bears played there in the 50s. Right on the wall. So we had an indoor game in 1932. The reason for the tie was that this is the last season before we had a championship game, and ties were not included in the standings. So we had a team from Chicago with a 6-1-6 mark, claiming the title against the Portsmouth Spartans, with a 6-1-4. So without the ties, they were both 6-1. Anyone know who the Portsmouth Spartans became? Detroit, correct. What can we give a man who has everything back there? I know when you were coaching, coach, you probably had to paddle some guys, so he did you on. Congratulations. The Portsmouth Spartans. So the game was played indoors, which was not bad, except right before the game, the circus came to town. So there was a dirt field, but the elephants had been roaming around. And said 2 or 3 of the players in both teams physically got sick because of the, I'm going to use a politically correct word, the scent of the place. Well, I'll leave that to your imagination. But the Bears had to play by different rules with the circus in town. They only had a 60-yard field with, and then an additional end zone. So once the ball moved to the 20, they would move it, and inside the 10, they move it back to 20 yards. There are no field goals as the balls would hit the ceiling. The Bears won 9-0. It was controversial. And I've included this burned roster here because the reason I got so interested in the Cardinals and the Bears history was that both teams had fires in their storage units. I think probably going back to the 50s or maybe earlier. This is one of the items that was salvaged was the program for that game. But the reason they won the game was the rule back then for passing was you had to be 5 yards behind the line of scrimmage to pass the ball. Rocco Nagurski got the ball and he faked going up the middle, passed the line of scrimmage, jumped into a jump pass to Red Grange for the touchdown that won the game. And of course, the coach of Portsmouth went nuts. He said it's against the rules, but referees were having a hard enough time overseeing a football game in that small area, and he allowed it. But that led to a whole bunch of changes the next year. We now forward passes were allowed anywhere behind the line of scrimmage. This separated the pro game from the college game. Hash marks were used because before they were playing in a hockey rink. So the ball was on the right side next to the wood. They'd have to bring it in a little bit to at least get a player in. But often you would have to lose a whole play just to get the ball towards the middle of the field. They moved the goalpost up. Field goals were easier then. And again, they were starting to get rid of a lot of the tie games, as we saw before. 10 ties between those two teams. And they now created 2 divisions because the National Football League saw that this championship game drew some interest. So the winners of the East and West would play for the overall championship. And Potsy Clark, who was the Portsmouth coach, was asked, how did he feel about the rules change that allowed passing from anywhere? And of course, he said, Nagurski would pass anywhere he wanted anyway. He would do it anyway. So it was a really great change. It separated. Of course, the colleges changed their rules a little later as well. There's a guy you never heard of, probably, Bull During. I'm only throwing this in because we're talking about Bears history. But he could throw a football on the mark behind his back 45 yards. And he did that in a game. It was an exhibition game, I believe, when he was running to the right. There's no one open, but he saw someone down there and he moved behind his back, hit the Bears receiver right in the chest, who never caught it because he wasn't expecting the ball to come to him. But that was his skill. So, a quick sidebar to one of the more unique players in Bears history. Then, of course, players were still working without helmets. In 1933, the Bears won another title. This was the first championship game between 2 divisions, won 23-21 over the Giants. Bill Hewitt, shown there without the helmet, he caught a lateral pass and brought it to another lateral. It was to a guy named Bill Carr, I believe, and it went all the way for the touchdown. So Hallis always admired Bill playing without a helmet. Said teams might knock him down, but he would get up and still make the tackle 20 yards downfield. In 1934, you may remember this, the college all-star game began. Annually, that would pit the defending professional champs against the best college players who were voted on by readers of the Chicago Tribune and other papers across the country. First game ended up 0-0, but that game kept on until 1976, donating millions to charity. In 34, the Bears added the first 1,000-yard rusher, Speedy Feathers. Of course, he ran behind Bronco Nagurski there on the left for an NFL record that still stands of 8.4 yards per carry. And he was named the All NFL team from the 1930s. And Hallis loved him. He said there was never really been a one-man team, but in 1934, because of Speedy Feathers, Bronco Nagurski, the team finished 13-0, still considered maybe one of the best teams, if not the best team ever assembled in the National Football League. Unfortunately, they had to play that championship game. And what happened there? The Bears came out strong. The game was in New York. They led 13-3 in the end of the third quarter. And during the second half on the frozen field, the Giants had gone and salvaged or scavenged tennis shoes, gym shoes, basketball shoes to wear, and on the frozen field. And one of the players on the Bears said to Hallis, they're putting on sneakers. What do you want to do? And Hallis said, yeah, just go step on their toes. But we should have done more. The Giants scored 27 points in the fourth quarter to win 30-13. The best team in football up to that time lost. There's nothing to say about this, but again, we talk about computers and scouting. If you're involved in scouting, you know how much work goes into that, how we test players, psychoanalyze them, 40-yard dashes, weights, their determination done by interviews. Back then, the Bears still had the chalkboard when they were getting ready for the Cardinals. And I love the picture because here's the players in suits and ties, looking good with George Hallis. The draft started in 1936. Some fun stories there. Read that one on the left about Joe Steinhardt. Pat Summerall, the old Cardinal, an announcer, said, he was the only person I knew who could smoke a cigar, chew tobacco, and drink whiskey all at the same time. Nothing about how good a football player he was. And some of those guys. And Danny Fortman was also picked in the draft. One who did not play for the Bears, though, was a guy named Jay Berwanger from the University of Chicago. He won the first Heisman Trophy. He and Hallis could not agree on a salary, so he never really played in the NFL. Found a game he did play, that's we talk about in the book. One game, but he made a nice living for himself outside of football. And then in 1937, the Bears went 9-1-1. They did lose the title game to Washington. Now Bronco, boom, he wanted his first pay raise. Hallis said no. Bronco left. And he was still a fairly young man. Came in the league in 1930, so he was still in his 20s and decided that was it. He became the heavyweight wrestling champion of the world. I'm not sure if wrestling was entertainment as it is today, or if it was really illegal, so to speak. But Bronco was the champion. Now we turn to the monsters in the mid-league in the 1940s. 4 championships in 6 years. Team that didn't win, again, was undefeated, but lost in 1942. And really, it started with Sid Luckman. In those 3 or 4 seasons, the Bears finished 37-5-1. Luckman had a what formation? T formation, correct. And it was something that Hallis worked with Clark Shaughnessy, who had been with the Bears at the University of Chicago, went to Stanford. And they really took football by storm. He wanted Luckman, said Hallis, so we created a new type of player, the T quarterback. And as you can imagine, the backfield lined up with the quarterback and then the 3 backs behind him. And the Bears would put a man kind of in motion, and they would have a little bit of an extra offensive advantage. Some of his credentials for Luckman, of course, he's in the Hall of Fame. He's an MVP of the league. Still holds a lot of the Bears records, I believe, including most touchdowns in one game, thinking to 7 touchdowns, 6 times an All-Pro. One of the other great players was a center, giving the ball to Luckman, Bulldog Turner. I love that nickname too. He played with the Bears from 40 to 52, and like many other teammates, was in the war in the service. Sid Luckman said he was one of the greatest football players ever. The Bulldog was a little nutty off the field. One of my favorite stories about Bulldog Turner was he liked to drink a little bit. One time he was on a third floor and leaning out a window after a few grogs, and he slipped and fell down. Luckily, he hit an awning on the second floor and another awning on the first floor before he landed unceremoniously on the street. And a cop came running up and he said to him, lying on the ground, hey, what's going on here? Bulldog looked up and said, I don't know, I just got here myself. Then we had One Play McCaffrey arriving in 1940. Alice considered him one of the best players in the history of the league. Very fast. He still holds the NFL record for average on punt returns all these years later. 1940 came the Bears' biggest win. They finished 8-3 to win their Western Division, but they lost a close game to Washington at the end of the season. And what happened was the Bears were down by a score, maybe a field goal, well, 7-3. And the Bears had lined up on the 1 yard line of Washington. Luckman went back to pass, threw a perfect bullet to his receiver, who was ready to catch him. Then the guy from Washington, the defender, pinned his arms back. So the ball bounced off him and the Bears were out of luck. There was no penalty called. Hallis went nuts. He was screaming and yelling at the refs, said there should be a penalty, but the decision stood. So after the game, George Preston Marshall of the Washington Redskins, the owner, called the Bears a bunch of crybabies. Why are they complaining? You know, they're losers. And that was all Hallis needed. He was a master manipulator. He was a very innovative coach and manager. He cut out every article he could find in newspapers back then, back when we had a lot of newspapers, pasted them up in the locker room before the Bears were going to face Washington in the title game a couple of weeks later. And what he reminded all those players was, you're a bunch of crybabies. Are you going to prove him right or going to lose again? Of course, they stormed out in the field. This is in 1940 in the championship game. Bears won 73-0. They just blasted Washington. And Luckman said it was the greatest game ever played. Everything we did was right. Everything they did was wrong. Sammy Baugh, quarterback of Washington, on one of the first plays of the game after the Bears took a 7-0 lead, threw what would have been another perfect touchdown pass to tie the game, but his receiver dropped it. So after the 73-0 game, a reporter asked Sammy, he said, hey, Sammy, I think the outcome would have been different if that guy caught your touchdown pass. And he looked at it, he had this slow Texas drawl. He said, well, it might have been 73-7. So that's as close as they came. The Bears repeated in 1941, finished the season 10-1, winning another championship. And then Hallis entered the service in 42. So he was hanging around with General Eisenhower, our future president, Luke Johnsos and Hunk Anderson, coached the team to an undefeated regular season, but again, they were undefeated, but lost the championship game, this time to Washington. So in 43, so many players were in the service, they talked Bronco Nagurski to come back and play for the Bears. He was not in the shape he wanted to be, so they said, well, maybe you can play tackle, you don't have to move as much. And he agreed to that, but later he liked fullback. He said, I feel sort of lost playing tackle. The Bears won the title. Bronco won another championship. The Bears said we're so bad that Coach Hunk Anderson once said that we had tryouts at the beginning of the season. We had enough players. And there were guys 40, 50, 60 years old trying out for the team. And finally, we decided that they can run 2 laps around the outfield, we'd sign them up. That's how bad it was. Bronco did well. The Cardinals, though, had a little tougher time. The Bears and the Cardinals wanted to merge. The league would not allow it. And so the Cardinals merged with the Steelers. They called the team the Card Pits. Everyone thought this would have a huge advantage of the league because they had all these players from both teams, but they lost all 10 of their games. In fact, the owner of the Pittsburgh Steelers called the team the worst in NFL history. How bad were they, you may ask? Well, newspapers widely changed the name from the Card Pits to Carpets. Why not? Everyone walks all over them. But in 46, Dallas returned to the Bears. How do you coach a bunch of returning war veterans with scars from bullets, men who have shot down planes, men who have been in physical activity? I think one of the players was responsible for sinking 2 German submarines. So Hallis decided he wasn't going to have any rules. He just wanted them to come back, be disciplined, discipline themselves, and play football. One of the papers used these big terms, human pachyderms and greyhounds, that they had 19 members back from their championship seasons in 1946. And so few coaches would be able to restrain a joyous yelp or two at the sight of the human pachyderms and greyhounds, especially if, like Hallis, they could feel all this was their very own. And so Hallis got rid of the rules, won another championship. These are some of the guys who played on all those winning teams. From the left were George McAfee, we talked about, Ray Bray, Sid Luckman, Bulldog Turner, and Ken Cavanaugh. And they won the 46 title with a 24-14 win. Meanwhile, that was the Bears' last championship for a while. Things reversed in Chicago. The Cardinals finally had a winning team. Charlie Trippi was signed by Mr. Bidwell, the owner of the team, who unfortunately passed away in April of 47. The 47 team won the NFL championship at Frozen Comiskey Park. Maybe learning from what the Giants did to the Bears a decade earlier, they put gym shoes on. And the Cardinals won 28-21. Elmer Angsman on the left scored 2 touchdowns, as did Trippi. Angsman was the type of player that Jimmy Councilman, the coach on the left there, really liked. While he was at Notre Dame in the game against Navy, he got hit so hard that it knocked several of his teeth out, but he wouldn't come out of the game. And Councilman read about that, and he said, a guy that tough, I want him on the Cardinals. So after since 1925, between victories in the NFL title games for the Cardinals. Unfortunately, those who still remember the Cardinals, it's now the longest winless streak of any professional sports team. So the Cubs broke their record. Cubs had it for a while, but now the Cardinals have that. Maybe this year will be the year. 1948 was the Snow Bowl. The Cardinals had, in my opinion, their best team ever. They won 11-1, and they were going to play the Eagles again. And a big blizzard hit the town of Philadelphia the night before. And you can kind of see something you'll never see again in the NFL. Players pulling the tarps off the field and shoveling snow off so they could play. So it was kind of a funny story leading up to that. The weather had not been that bad during the week. Chet Bolger, who was a big tackle for the Cardinals, shared a story with me years ago. He said, back then we all got $2 a day in meal money. We could buy whatever we wanted. So he and a friend, I think it was Rob Morrow, his roommate, went out and bought sliders. Anybody remember sliders? I think we still have sliders. If anyone says they've had them after midnight, but I'm sure they're similar to the sliders today. So they each bought a big bag of sliders, and they had money left over so they could each buy a quart of buttermilk. I've never had buttermilk, so it doesn't sound too good. But they were so happy. They went up to their hotel room before the game. They propped open the window, put their feet on the windowsill, and said, man, it doesn't get any better than this. Eating sliders before a football game. And unfortunately, the Cardinals lost in 1948, 7-0 on a late fumble in the snow. Some say the game should never have been played, but they did play it. And the Cardinals, as the champions, played the college all-star game the following summer, defeating the all-stars pretty soundly. And at that time, there was still some discussion whether the college players were indeed much better than the professional players. And the Cardinals beat them pretty soundly in front of 101,000 people at Soldier Field, still the largest crowd ever to see the Cardinals play in this country. And so in the 1950s, we didn't see any championships, and I've hit my time limit. In the 50s, we continued playing. This is one of the great fights that ended a game in 1956. You can see the Cardinals in white and the Bears in the dark going to battle there at Wrigley Field in one of the final battles before the Cardinals finally left Chicago. So thank you very much for being here. Any questions at all you might have? It was great sharing some of the stories. We do have some books if one would like to grab one before you leave. And if you have questions, I hope you enjoyed your prizes, and we hope to see you again soon. And if you're interested in more historical football, we do have a Facebook page called Chicago Cardinals. Also a Twitter account, although I never knew what Twitter was for about a year ago. My daughter explained it to me, and I couldn't even spell it. And then we have a podcast on the Sports History Network. If you have a computer, look up that. And every other week there's a new title. And of course, the new book coming at the end of September, but here tonight, if anyone's interested. So thank you very much. And if you have any questions, thank you.